The strategic resolution of the 2026 maritime and missile crisis between the United States and Iran provides a definitive masterclass in the hyper-pragmatic, legally elusive architecture of modern international diplomacy. While global markets braced for a grand televised peace summit at a luxury resort overlooking Lake Lucerne in Bergenstock, Switzerland, complete with the geopolitical theater of handshakes, media blitzes, and multi-state mediation, the final de-escalation document was instead executed silently, remotely, and entirely through digital signatures. This anticlimactic transition from a historic summit to an electronic lease-style agreement reveals the true nature of the instrument. It was not a legally binding treaty, but a highly fluid memorandum of understanding, MOU. Under the conventions of international law, an MOU acts as a political commitment rather than an enforceable contract, functioning effectively as a mutual statement of intent with reputational rather than judicial consequences. This structural flexibility is precisely why modern heads of state consistently bypass the formal treaty architecture. According to Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution, a formal treaty demands a two-thirds supermajority in the Senate, an unachievable 67-vote threshold in an era of deep legislative polarization. To circumvent this institutional barrier, executives utilize a descending ladder of diplomatic mechanisms, moving from congressional executive agreements to sole executive agreements, and ultimately to non-binding MOUs that require zero legislative ratification or oversight. The core legal distinction between these instruments is governed not by their formal titles, but by what international lawyers call the secret grammar of diplomacy, a framework validated by the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. While binding treaties deploy mandatory, commanding language such as shall and agree, non-binding political pactors deliberately implement conditional aspirational verbs like will, intend, and should. This dynamic was famously highlighted by the International Court of Justice in the 1994 Qatar versus Bahrain case, which established that the objective intent and precise phrasing of a text override its administrative letterhead. In the context of the 2026 Islamabad Memorandum, this soft phrasing is entirely load-bearing. Paragraph 5 stipulates that Iran will use its best efforts to ensure toll-free commercial transit through the critical Strait of Hormuz for a transient 60-day window, while paragraph 6 outlines an aspirational framework to mobilize up to $300 billion in private sector investment for reconstruction, rather than committing direct state treasuries. By punting the most volatile core disputes, including ballistic missile frameworks, regional proxy alignments, and long-term nuclear enrichment mechanics, into future technical talks, the document operates as a strategic bridge designed to halt immediate kinetic warfare while preserving absolute operational optionality for both signatories. Yet this inherent flexibility exposes the deal to severe structural fragility, a vulnerability that directly mirrors the rise and fall of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. Because the Obama administration originally classified the JCPOA as a non-binding political commitment to avoid a hostile Senate, the Trump administration possessed the unilateral domestic authority to dissolve the entire arrangement with a single executive memo in 2018, despite documented Iranian compliance at the time. This historical precedent underscores a brutal truth in global affairs. An agreement resting on political commitment survives only as long as the immediate political will of its authors. This structural volatility has triggered immense friction across global financial sectors, where commodity traders must continuously price immediate expectations rather than legal enforceability. The Strait of Hormuz represents the ultimate economic choke point, managing the daily transit of roughly 20.3 million barrels of oil, accounting for approximately 20% of global petroleum liquids. Because energy markets are priced strictly at the margin, even a minor disruption in this 21-mile-wide channel triggers asymmetric price spikes, which was demonstrated when physical crude surged toward $150 a barrel following the initial closure of the strait. The signature of the MOU immediately erased these wartime gains, dropping benchmark Brent crude back to near $79 as restrictions were lifted, only for the market to violently whipsaw days later when non-signatory domestic actions, specifically continuous military engagements involving Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, prompted regional security forces to reclamp transit channels. This illustrates the acute limits of bilateral political agreements. An MOU cannot legally bind or constrain third-party actors, who were never at the negotiating table. Furthermore, the internal stability of the pact faces compounding pressure from domestic leadership transitions within Tehran. Following the rise of a more hardline clerical faction under Mojtaba Khamenei, while the strategic design of the memorandum seeks to eventually harden these loose political promises into international law by wrapping them in a binding United Nations Security Council resolution, mimicking the structural blueprint of UN Resolution 2231, modern history proves that even international mandates offer little protection when a superpower decides to pivot. Ultimately, the 2026 agreement stands as a vital but deeply delicate de-escalation framework. It functions as a highly effective bridge constructed purely out of shifting political intentions, demonstrating that while such instruments are uniquely capable of halting immediate conflicts, they remain fundamentally vulnerable to the next geopolitical shift or domestic election cycle. Deepening the analysis into the legal and domestic mechanics of this arrangement, the use of the MOU framework represents an intentional structural detour. When an administration is faced with a Senate that can barely gather a simple majority to fund standard government operations, the possibility of achieving a supermajority for a highly controversial foreign policy accord is mathematically zero. Historically, American presidents have systematically adapted to this reality by treating the traditional treaty process as the historical exception rather than the contemporary rule, with over 80% of international commitments executed through executive mechanisms. This dynamic creates a critical paradox where domestic convenience actively generates international instability. The lack of built-in enforcement mechanisms, dispute settlement courts, or formal ratification clauses means that the agreement entirely lacks institutional structural support. The enforcement of the 2026 memorandum relies on external geopolitical leverage, specifically the explicit threat of military strikes and economic re-isolation, rather than internal legal clauses. This complete reliance on external deterrence turns every single political speech, localized military skirmish, and media leak into a volatile market event, forcing global energy sectors to treat the peace deal as a fluctuating trial subscription subject to immediate cancellation. Furthermore, the ambiguity regarding key baseline terms, such as the exact valuation and deployment schedule of Iran's frozen assets, which senior officials have publicly contested, highlights the dangers of prioritizing diplomatic speed over precision. While the document outlines a sequenced 60-day operational window to transition these fluid political understandings into a robust United Nations framework under the authority of the UN Charter, the historical termination of prior resolutions demonstrates that international legal umbrellas cannot protect a diplomatic framework once the underlying political consensus between major powers dissolves. The 2026 Islamabad Memorandum therefore functions as a highly sophisticated temporary diplomatic bypass that effectively managed to freeze an active global conflict in the short term, but its long-term survival remains entirely bound to the immediate, shifting incentives of the political leaders holding the pens.